Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us this year at Retcon. This is our 6th year now? Yeah.
2018.
God blimey. It's our 6th year now running Retcon, and obviously every year we've grown both in terms of the systems that we have on show and our talks track here. And we are kicking off this year, I think, with quite frankly a fantastic speaker. Certainly someone I've wanted to talk to for a very long time, given the machine that he's responsible for. We were, of course, joined by Roland Perry, one of the original team, very much arguably the father of the Amstrad CPC, the home computer that really started my fascination with computing. Mm-hmm. So, Roland, welcome. We got a lot of questions for you. So, I mean, we can kick off straight with the questions, or I don't know if there's anything that you want to say to start off with.
Yeah, well, can I just say, thank you all for coming along. I feel like I'm a Londoner myself, so I feel like I've come back home here rather than have to fly off to Spain or go to Blackpool like I will in the summer. I'm happy to answer these questions. I'm going to stick around for much of the day, so if you don't get your question answered, then just come and see me. There's an Amstrad corner down by the desk, by the entrance desk. Yeah. So I'll be taking some of this stuff down there. I can also talk more about some of these exhibits, which are all very important. We're just talking about my hat, that's my flat cap that's in one of those pictures there. Well, at the time we did that, we were also writing this preliminary, see, it doesn't even say CPC 464 on it yet, and that's one of the grey prototypes there. It's really important to us to get the enthusiasm of the games industry to write games for a computer that wasn't anywhere near being in the shops yet. And we had to convince them that, yes, we really are going to put 100,000 of these in Dixon's for Christmas. So get cracking and write some games, and you've basically got 6 months to do it in.
I mean, it was obviously a very interesting project from the get-go. I mean, you were coming into a market that already had two very established players. Before I get to the questions, I've got to ask. So, I mean, with that, when you were working on developing the machine, given the market you were entering into, what was the primary objective of what you were trying to achieve with what you were designing? Was it about trying to improve on what was out there, or was it purely about doing, Amstrad's own thing? Regardless of what the competition was doing?
Right, I think we've got to remember was back then Amstrad was a company that sold mainly video recorders, TV sets. It's a very strong portable TV product, which is actually the same thing we used for the monitor for it. And every year it had what it called a blockbuster product, which you would put into the shops in roughly October. Then people would buy them for 3 months. With a bit of luck, you sold them all. And then it was all quiet over the summer, and then you stick another blockbuster product in the year after. So previous blockbuster products had been, for example, a CB radio, and all sorts of other things like that. And so what we were looking at the time was, can we help them? Because they didn't have any in-house computer designing capability, because they were an audio TV type of company, and they looked around and there's nothing that they could buy in and badge, right? Certainly not in the sort of time scale they were talking about. So they asked us to help them out. They'd already designed the box, and of course we were given a grey one to play with. Yeah. So there's one of these in grey, all the rest of it. There was a board that was that shape but with no components on it. And they said, well, can you make us one of those? And this was in the first week of August. And they said, well, preferably we'd like to see a working sample by about the end of November. So
no pressure then.
No pressure there then. We're just going to make 100,000 of them, and then next year we'll make something else. I mean, next year they also did a camcorder, I remember. They got into Sky TV dishes. They started off with B Sky B and then swapped horses over to Sky, because there was a bit of a kerfuffle between those two companies. So the idea was to make something that actually worked, was manufacturable in quantity. So you've got to start making 10,000 of these a month, almost from a standing start. And one of these diagrams I've got here, which people can come and see later, there's in that corner there, there's the manufacturing schedule. Well, the problem with most of the other computers on the market, apart possibly from the Commodore 64, was that they're almost literally hand-built. People were kind of making them in garages and various sheds and putting them together and selling a couple of thousand here and a couple of thousand there, whereas we needed to make a big bang. And Amstrad, the company, had enormous expertise in production engineering.
Yeah.
And one of the things that always used to floor a lot of the other manufacturers, particularly the smaller indigenous manufacturers, was they couldn't make, they had no idea how do you actually make one of those. All right? They had no idea how to do that. So they're sitting there kind of bending bits of tin and bits of wood, and no, that's not right. Whereas Amstrad could write on the back of an envelope a spec for that, fax it off to Japan, and then a month later you get one of those back. Yeah. And that hasn't changed from that August until they stopped doing the machine, basically.
Yeah.
Right? So they're really good at doing that. So it had to work, and it had to be at least as good as some kind of mythical mixture of the Spectrum and the Commodore 64 and the BBC Micro. And we also had the advantage that I used to write, the company I was working for, we were external contractors at the time, the company I was working for, it did a lot of prototyping work, which is why we could work on things like that, and we could call on people. We could, I'm going to lose my thread here. Will I start off saying there?
You were talking about prototyping.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, so we had prototyping, but what we had was about a 2 or 3 year advantage, because the BBC Micro had been out for at least 2 years, the Spectrum had been out for 3 years, the Commodore 64 had been out for maybe, I can't remember, 4 years,
about
something
4
like
years
that.
At that stage, yeah.
And so, that's what I was saying. We had an in-house magazine that we used to publish in a consultancy company, and I wrote a column every month reviewing computers. So I'd already done an in-depth review of the BBC Micro, for example, so I knew exactly what was inside it. And a lot of the people I recruited, and there's a poster there with some of the team on it, they'd also been sitting around going, well, we quite like the BBC Micro, but this bit we could improve on if we're starting again today, or that bit we could do better. Oh, Spectrum's nice, but wouldn't it be great if it had slightly more colours? And so on and so forth. So what we did was we just took all the best bits and bunged them all together and crossed our fingers, and that's the result.
Well, I think we can all agree it came together rather nicely. So let's turn to some of the questions that we've had sent in ahead of today. I've got an interesting question here about how the CPC went international. Do you recall which countries were originally planned as target markets for the CPC versus where it eventually ended up? And what was the situation with the rebadging of it? You know, we obviously know it was a Schneider in Germany, and what happened elsewhere, because the firmware suggests that there was a lot of plans for rebadging. Yeah, well, there's on the circuit board here, there's a little pad where you can put some dip switches on the prototypes or wire links on the real one, so that the only thing that changes is the message that comes up. So it doesn't say Amstrad 464, it says Schneider 464 or AWAR, which is the Australian distributor. So what we'd been doing, or Amstrad had been doing, I'll call them we now because we ended up working with in-house in Amstrad quite soon. They were already buying things like video recorders and TVs and car cassette radios and whatever from the Japanese, and badging them and selling them under various brand names
in different countries and indeed in different retail outlets in the same country. So SciShow was Dixons' home brand.
That's right.
Right, but a lot of the SciShow equipment was actually designed by Amstrad and procured by Amstrad from Orion, who's the Japanese manufacturer. So it's all terribly incestuous. So it's just kind of second nature for them to say, well, we're going to start off selling it as Amstrad, but maybe Schneider will come along and want to order some because they've ordered everything else we've done before, so why wouldn't they order this? So the kind of joker in the pack was Indiscomp in Spain.
Yeah.
And Indiscomp wrote quite a lot of games, I think probably for the Commodore 64, and they got wind of this, and they came over and basically hassled us, sort of doorstepped us and said, right, lend us one of your prototype machines and we'll write some games for you. And we said, oh, all right then. So we gave them one and off they went. And they came back surprisingly quickly afterwards with 2 existing games. One's Roland on the Ropes, the other's Roland in the Caves. And we looked at those and we said, oh, yeah, that's jolly good. You know, you seem to have ported the game very successfully. We'll tell you what, we'll license those, but we won't call them the old Spanish names for those games.
Yeah.
We'll give them an English name, and what we'll do is we'll start a brand called Roland, so it'll be Roland on the Ropes, and then Roland does this and Roland does that and all the rest of it. And they said, well, could we also sell the keyboards? As well as supplying you games to sell. And we said, well, go on then, write us an order, and we'll make some for you. And I think we ended up making about 50,000 for them in that first year, which was roughly a quarter of the production. So they were quite a big customer. We also started shipping a few of them to Schneider, although they only really got excited with the 6128 because
Yes.
they wanted things which were more kind of small business orientated.
I own 2 of those.
All right. and also we started Amstrad France, which always was an in-house dealer or whatever. And so we started selling these computers. I think it was their first product that Amstrad France did. So we sold a few of those out to Amstrad France. And Amstrad France were the people who really started us off down this road of translating everything into different languages. Because the French are a little bit sensitive, you may have noticed, about French-speaking things.
Yes.
And having computers with AZERTY keyboards on, not QWERTY keyboards on. And they said, well, obviously, what's it here? You've got to translate it and put an AZERTY keyboard on. So I said, oh, right then. And that started us down the route that we ended up with a Spanish keyboard on the Spanish unit. I suppose there must have been a German keyboard on the German one.
No, there wasn't,
Wasn't
weirdly.
there?
No. And this surprised me. And you're absolutely right. I mean, obviously, the French market is very much, about, French language products, not just for computing, really for everything. But normally, so is Germany. And I say this as a journalist, knowing that it's very hard to get content into the German market unless it's in German. So I always assumed that the German machines would have had a QWERTZ keyboard. But like I said, in my little Amstrad collection, I've got 2 Schneider 6128s, and they have QWERTY keyboards. It's the UK spec keyboard.
Well, that might be because if they were thinking about, again, the sort of small business market, and the small business market would have been used to buying early IBM PCs and things like that.
Which would
and
not
they
have had German keyboards.
And they wouldn't have had German keyboards, so it would have actually been an aberration, perhaps. The other thing we did was, this is the point of sales material, which we gave to the, I don't think we gave them, I think people like Dixons had to buy this, and they handed it out. We charged them like a penny each, or whatever the print cost was. And we had German and French and Spanish versions of those. So in fact, we started the project off with, can you design us that keyboard? So we got that done fairly promptly and efficiently, and they then turned around and said, well, can you arrange to design a brochure for us? And by the way, can you translate it into all these languages? And so we ended up with the kind of the tail wagging the dog a bit there. And it was all this putting things into the market, having done the computer, that occupied us so much. Also, of course, putting it into the UK market. So at the time, the number one magazine was Personal Computer
BCW,
World magazine, and it was compulsory if you were launching a new computer to get it as the cover article on in PCW magazine. And also, not only did they give it a rave review, but they also drew this. I've got the original of this on my office wall at home. the slowly exploded diagram.
It's a wonderful bit of illustration.
Yeah, and it was written by Guy Cooney, who's a good friend of mine.
It's a good friend of mine as well.
Unfortunately passed away about 10 years ago. But, yeah, there we go.
Again, it was a very interesting time in the computing space. I miss that publications don't do stuff like that anymore. But just going back, I mean, I just want to do a follow-up question. Obviously, you're talking about the different SKUs that started going into the market for things like France and Spain and Germany. So I've got two quick follow-up questions.
Mm-hmm.
One is, first of all, why is the German version of the 464 just grey? Why did it lose all the colour keys?
Well, again, that may have been because Bernie Schneider thought the coloured keyboard looked a bit kind of gamesy and amateurish. They were the only organisation who succeeded in getting us to ship things in different colours and things like that. Everybody else, it was like Ford, you can have any colour as long as it's black. So, but they also annoyed us enormously at the time because they called the word processor. They insisted on calling it the Joyce, which was our code name for it, just like the code name for this was Arnold.
Yes.
And they insisted on calling it the Joyce, and they insisted on selling it, perversely, not as a word processor, but as a CPM machine in competition with things like IBM PCs to run your SuperCalc and WordStar and stuff. Whereas we designed it to be a word processor running those other things completely by accident and incidentally, and they swapped it.
Swapped it on its head, yeah.
Swapped it on its head. But the Germans seemed to manage to get away with doing that, whereas other countries didn't.
How bizarre. Now, of course, with the early ones that went into Spain, you had a little challenge there, which was the Spanish taxation rules on machines with, what was it, 64K or less of RAM, because the early CPC 464s weren't 464s, they were 472s, weren't they?
Well, there were two phases to that. The Spanish wanted to protect their own indigenous computer market, which actually didn't exist and never did exist. And their first go at it was to say, well, it's got to have an Enya key on the keyboard. That'll fool them, they said. No one will bother to ship us a computer with an Enya keyboard, but except we were already doing that because it was just second nature for us to do that.
Yes.
But you wouldn't get, say, BBC, you wouldn't get Acorn shipping a machine with an Enya keyboard on, I wouldn't have thought. They thought it'd be too much trouble. So, and then they said, OK, well, that's not working. There's computers still flooding into the country with Enya keys on. We'll say you can't sell anything that's 64K or less. And, of course, that meant that there were no Commodore 64s available in Spain, because that was 64K, and you wouldn't have been able to sell a Spectrum or a BBC Micro or anything like that. And so we had this problem, which was, how do we make a machine that's more than 64K? And it's all in his memoirs. So what Lord Sugar did was, he said, well, look, he said, I remember back in the day when we were selling transistor radios, there was this kind of competition of, it's like having a car and you put turbo on the boot and gear and all these kinds of go faster stripes down the side. Well, a go faster stripe doesn't make a car go any faster, but seems to make people buy them more. And he said, well, we used to make these transistor radios, and there were 6 transistors, because that's all we needed to make a perfectly good transistor radio. And then other people started coming out with 8 transistor radios. And he said, well, that's no good, because people assume that's better.
Yes.
And then we got one of those, and we looked inside it, and 6 of the transistors were running the radio, and the other 2 weren't doing anything useful at all. So we said, oh, OK, we'll make a 10 transistor radio. So that's going to have 6 transistors being the radio and 4 transistors doing not very much at all. And that, again, made people buy it. So all the 472 is that theory rolled across to a computer. And of course, there wasn't anything useful to be done with that extra 16K because no one's going to write a game for a quirky machine like that.
Of course.
And we wouldn't actually have been able to relay out the circuit board in a couple of weeks, which is what it would have taken in order to do that. So if I remember correctly, the extra chip hung off the side of one of these ones here.
That's right.
So Well, there we are. We shipped them. We got away with it, and the rest they say is history. Of course, we bought out a 6128 soon afterwards, which would have, there was something useful you could do with the other 64K.
Absolutely. So another question that we had sent in, bit of a technical one this, but I'll be curious to see if there's an answer for it. Concerning the CPC gate array, does the trick of 27 colours, the trick of 27 colours, the consequences of not having been able to offer 64 colour palette, I think they're basically saying, what was the rationale behind
I know what your
the palette system?
I know what your question is. Actually, the circuitry for the 27 colours isn't in the gate array. It's in these transistors just down there. The original spec we were given was 16 colours. Of course, almost every computer in those days had 16 colours. Part of the problem was they're not actually 16 different colours. They're 8 colours and 8 colours in bright.
Yes.
Okay, so it's so we set off merrily and said, well, we'll just copycat what everybody else does, and also all the screen resolutions. It still annoys me a bit when I read old reviews of the machine that people say, oh, well, the graphics are not up to much. Well, it's the same graphics that everybody else had. I don't know what they're talking about. It didn't have sprites, but then that's the next kind of more sophisticated computer. So what we did was, having decided to make the gate array in order to soak up the logic, so that's an original Ferranti gate array there, and if that wasn't there, there'd be about another 30 or 40 of these chips on the circuit board. And so we set off one of my contractors had a guy working for him who we set off to design the gate array, and we gave him this spec, and it said 16 colours, and he just came back one day and said, well, what if I could give you 27 colours? And we said, well, we'll take that. How are you going to do that? And the answer is that to make 8 colours, you've got red, green and blue in half on and full on.
Yes.
All right? But what you can do is, actually it's in 0 and full on, isn't it? So what he did was, he increased the cost of the computer by about 3 resistors here, and said, right, out of the gate array, we'll give you 0, 1 and a half. So that's 3 levels. 3 times 3 times 3 is 27. So suddenly you've got 27 colours. All right.
Interesting.
The palette is in fact 32, and some of the colours repeat.
Yeah.
So there's 27 separate colours, and then the other 5 or whatever it is are just random repeats of some of the other colours. Probably nobody uses them, but you could if you wanted to. And that's how the 27 colours came out.
Okay. And that probably leads on to an interesting follow-up question, which was, of course, following on from this machine, of course, we did have the Plus machines, which added additional capabilities. But someone has asked, Amstrad's intentions aside, how would you have designed your version of the Plus machine, i.e. sort of a sort of a semi-update on the 464?
Well, the simple answer to that is I wouldn't, because we were working really hard on a family of products. And so the first year we had the 464, the next year we had the PCW, and to a certain extent the 6128.
Yep.
The year after that we had the PC 1512, and then the year after that the 1640, and then the year after that the PPC and the 386 IBM PCs. So if someone had come along to me when I was in the middle of trying to design a 386 PC and said, what do you think we ought to go and stick in a Amstrad Plus or a Spectrum Plus, I'd have said, I've got no idea, talk to this man over here, he'll tell you. That's Cliff Lawson, who was my sort of chief engineer at the time, so I had very little to do with it. I mean, I can throw ideas at people, but it wasn't my project by that stage.
But you never had any thoughts about, had you been presented with the opportunity of, doing a refresh on the original machine, how, in hindsight, things you would have changed?
Well, I think the closest we came to that is we said, well, we've got the games computers, we've got the PCW. What if we made a colour PCW? Okay,
Yeah.
rather than the monochrome one. So we've got a bigger screen.
Yep.
All right. We've got up to 512K of memory, so either 255, 12K memory, so plenty of memory. Just stick a colour tube in, fiddle the, slightly bigger gate array and all the rest of it, and we could have 64 colours, and but also a CPC compatibility mode. So when you booted it up, you'd either stick in a CPC compatibility disk and it'd boot up into CPC,
Yeah.
or you'd have a monochrome word processor, or you'd have this sort of colour word processor thing. So it would have done all three sort of at the same time. The problem was we were so busy doing other projects that we just didn't have the time to bring that to market. And we got some prototypes made, and it was the only computer which we worked on all the time I was there, which was about 7 years. It's the only project we worked on that we didn't bring to market because we just didn't have the hours in the day to do it.
That would have been an interesting one. One more question I'll bring up from here, and then we'll throw it over to the audience. So, of course, obviously, the 464 was a tape-based machine, but it was shortly followed by a disk drive add-on. And the question has been asked, again, why 3-inch discs, and why only single density?
Well, my answer to the question, why 3 inches, well, what would you have put in there instead? I looked at microdrive equivalents, and they weren't terribly good. Somebody had a really wacky, soft 2-inch floppy drive, and I don't think anybody ever bought those, but I had some engineering examples of those. You couldn't stick a 5 1/4 inch soft floppy in there because it was too expensive and physically too big. You couldn't stick a 3 1/2 inch drive in there because no one had invented them yet, and it was about 4 years later that IBM actually finally got round to saying, okay, out with the 5 1/4, in with the 3 1/2.
Yep.
So it was a wacky kind of proprietary drive that very few people put in a very few test instruments and things like that. The drive also cost more than the whole CPC, so it just wasn't possible. But then, suddenly, we've got this 3-inch drive, which is plug compatible with the 5 1/4 inch, so we can easily build a disk controller for it because it's the same disk controller as we would have built for a 5 1/4 inch. You can stick a 3-inch drive on an IBM PC and it just simply works. You don't have to do anything other than just plug it in, develop your software on the IBM PC, write it to the floppy, stick it in the 6128, and so on and so forth. So it's just a complete no-brainer, really. But I think the most critical part of it was, say, there wasn't a 3 1/2 inch available at the time. As for single and double density, well, the entry-level one was the same density as a 5 1/4 inch floppy. So at that time, that was single density, but we soon stuck a double density and a double-sided one in the PCW.
Yeah.
Although that's a more expensive drive to buy. You can fit a game on a single density floppy, so why does it need to store more than that?
Fair enough, can't argue with that. Well, look, I think we've done quite a few of the questions that came in ahead of time. I'd like to throw it open to the audience. We got any questions from the floor for Roland?
Stunned into
Stunned
silence.
silence. Come on, there's got to be a question out there. Go on.
You already touched on it, but I assume that you played your cards close to your chest when you were developing this machine, so other computer manufacturers wouldn't try and go one step beyond the cells. But were you looking closely at other manufacturers to make sure you were going to produce something that would go one step beyond that?
No, not really. I mean, we played our cards close to our chest because there was a certain amount of shame involved in leaking the fact that you were developing a product and then failing to get it to market. All right, that was really bad for the company's reputation. It was really bad. It was a listed company. It's really bad for, all your city traders get very nervous when you pull tricks like that. So we couldn't really launch the product until we got working ones and we could show them to people and we're confident it was actually going to be a product. We didn't care whether anybody else copied it because we knew that even if they copied it, they couldn't get it into the shops in 4 months' time, but we could. And we weren't particularly worried about the year after that. Although what we actually did, of course, was bring out the 664 and then the 6128, which had a few more steps down the road there. The market was awash with so-called competitors, all really good ideas, okay, some of them with really good features in them, but unfortunately they couldn't manufacture them, not for any price. So what's the good of the Enterprise, Flan as we called it, was one of those. Well, what's the good of a computer? Dragon's another one. People saying, oh, the Dragon was much better. Yes, but I think they managed to hand build about 15,000 of them and then go broke. What's the good in that? So being very much mass market, we had to, hit it hard and hit it quick and get in. And we thought originally then get out. But actually we stayed in there. And I think one of my, proudest moments perhaps you can say is when newspapers, when they're writing about Amstrad, started saying Amstrad the computer company, not Amstrad the TV and audio company. So we kind of completely turned that supertank around.
Next question, you sir.
Just wondering, based on what you said earlier about looking at the sort of best bits of the other computers that were around, I had the CPC 6128, and I sort of loved my TV, but didn't have a TV. I had a monitor in my bedroom with my computer, and I remember possibly an Amstrad actually one of the computer magazine that someone had invented a converter for the monitor. I'm just wondering, did you bring out monitors with it to sell more kits? Because obviously like BBC Micro and whatever had monitors as well, but all my mates were able to plug their computers into their tellies because they had Spectrums and Commodore 64s or whatever. So was there a conscious decision with that?
Absolutely conscious decision to produce an all-in-one product. It had to have everything there. It had to have the keyboard, it had to have the tape, it had to have the monitor, it had to have, we sat down there, welcome tape. All right, had to have a user manual, had to have a user club, all right. They had the first magazine, so everything had to be there. And of course, this was another kind of thing that the competitors just couldn't do, because you had to have a well-oiled machine behind you to actually churn that kind of thing out. And so it had to be all in one, and like the PCW was all in one. You got the keyboard, the monitor, the printer, the software, the user manual, everything was there. You just take it home, unpack it and get it going. This kind of crawling behind the back of the TV, and I was talking to a lot of people at a similar event to this last weekend in Wolverhampton, and they said, well, yes, every evening there was a fight. Am I going to be able to play my games, or is Mum going to watch Coronation Street? And you just completely quash that argument. And of course, the kids like that because they could take it up to their bedroom. And they say, oh, I'm upstairs to do my homework now, Dad. And they say, okay, great, And then you sit there playing games with it all night, out of sight.
And you turn the volume down.
Yeah.
This is true.
Yeah.
But we have to remember, if you think back to like 1984, most homes only had one TV. I know we only did. So yeah, with those other machines, it was a fight for who got to use it. The CPC broke that mold because suddenly you didn't need it. You had a monitor, you had a self-contained environment, which was definitely a huge edge over what else was in the market.
Yeah, and I alluded to earlier, doing particularly the colour monitor was really, really easy because it's literally the 14-inch portable TV that Orion had been making for us for years, but without a TV tuner in it. Just plug it straight into the computer. The green screen monitor is a slight departure, but it's the same basic idea. And going back to the 27 colours, the way we arranged it, the palette and everything, was that you could run the same game on the machine, either in colour or in grayscale. You didn't have to reprogram it. One of the really big problems with, particularly although it wasn't a direct competitor, but one of the problems with the IBM PC was you either had a colour one or a monochrome one, a Hercules card or something, and you couldn't run games. There were games which would only run on the monochrome graphics adapter, and there were games that would only run on the colour graphics adapter. It's really difficult to find a game or even any software that would run on both of them. But we managed that, and all you do is just plug in the green screen monitor, and there you've got all your grayscales.
Which, from my perspective, worked great, because my first CPC, I had the green monitor. I was initially thinking, my parents have stitched me up here. They've made me buy a serious computer. But fortunately, you found, when I started running games, like, this actually works really well in the green screen environment. You don't lose any visibility of what you're doing. Although, of course, when I eventually ended up with a colour monitor, it was a revelation. But I did like the fact that, as you said, the colour monitor was just, effectively a 14-inch Orion telly stripped down. But then, of course, later on you started adding things like, you could buy the tuner add-on, which turned it back into a TV.
Yeah, that was made mainly for the French market for some obscure reason to do with taxes in France. So, but you could buy that in the UK as well. But the disappointment was if you plugged the monitor, and again, it's just like everybody else's. There's a little kind of matchbox-sized modulator thing that everybody used. You plug that into a TV set and you get a picture that's not a patch on the bundled colour monitor.
Absolutely.
So why would anybody do that, really?
Indeed. Next question, you sir, and then Steve and I'll come to you afterwards. No, go for it.
So I grew up in France where the CPC was the number one micro by far. When I moved here, I didn't realize to which extent it was all about the spectrum in the C64. And I still feel to this day, having online discussions, that many people don't realize the CPC's capabilities. Basically has all of the graphics modes, both low res, high color, and high res. That's the spectrum for the C64. And I was just wondering how you felt about maybe the CPC being even more successful abroad than it is at home. I feel there is some unfairness. Britain should really be proud about the CPC first and foremost. Seems to be all about the spectrum.
Well, yes, I think there's still a much bigger fan following in the UK for the Spectrum and for particularly Acorn computers. Acorn's kind of cornered the market in retro, really, and every museum you go to in this country with computers in, there might be one Amstrad stuck in the corner, and there'll be 10 BBC Model Bs and... Huh?
Yeah. We
so
boxed the boy in a room.
Everywhere you go, you're falling over those things there. And there's a certain amount of rivalry between the two teams because going back to the original history, the BASIC that we got for the Amstrad computer is it's the Z80 second processor BASIC for the BBC Micro with colour and sound added to it. And the only reason we could do it is because we could license that from Locomotive, and they'd already done 80% of the work because there wasn't enough time to do 100% of the work. So that again is a kind of a sort of leapfrogging off other people's other people have done in the past. A friend of mine used to run part of the BBC. Well, he used to do a lot of the second processor stuff at the BBC. And in fact, Locomotive Software, when I went to see them, they were a bit of a loose end because they were dabbling with some kind of 64-bit second processor for the BBC Micro, but the people doing the hardware couldn't provide prototypes of the hardware, and therefore without prototypes of the hardware they couldn't convert their BASIC up to this 64, I can't remember the manufacturer now, but the this particular second processor card, so they're a bit of a loose end. And when I came along and said, well, can we license your BASIC, then so they bit my arm off, basically. Of course, this goes back to something which is all about kind of intellectual property and how do you design, how do you future-proof your designs, and as somebody asked earlier, perhaps how do you protect it from other people? Well, as it turns out, although the BBC BASIC was written sort of in-house, it wasn't entirely in-house, but it was sort of in-house, the Spectrum BASIC was written by a set of contractors, all right, who it turned out later had never actually signed a contract with Sinclair. So that belonged to them. The BASIC inside the second processor BASIC that BBC, that Spectrum, that Sinclair had commissioned was licensed from Locomotive, so Locomotive could then relicense it to other people. So if you really want to protect yourself, you actually have to either do it in-house or get an exclusive license for it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's a possibility that somebody else can come and kind of whip the carpet from under your feet. Of course, the biggest software house writing BASIC at the time was Microsoft. And they had MSX BASIC, for example.
Yep.
They also had other BASICs. And I used to do a lot of work with Microsoft in later years with Windows and DOS and things like that. And we looked very, very briefly at licensing Microsoft's BASIC, but it was absolutely obvious that it would take us about a year to go through the lawyers to sign the contracts up. And then it would cost so much a copy it would be uneconomical, and we needed something in 3 months' time that was cheap. So that Microsoft took themselves out of that one.
Steve.
Stand up as a concept.
Yeah.
Some people know I'm not a gamer, so the whole CPC bypass. But I wanted to say thank you for the PCW. I bought that. I had a Spectrum, which I got bored with pretty quick. But the PCW is what I call the first proper computer for people like me. It did everything I want. I could program on it. I had one game, Batman, which was quite good in green.
It did, surprisingly, yeah.
It was quite good. But it's a fantastic machine. So is there anything you want to... I don't know if I came in too late or I missed anything about the PCW, because I think it's such a great little machine.
Well, yes, I'm prouder of the PCW than I'm of the CPC, which maybe I shouldn't say at a gamers convention like this, but nobody's running PCW conventions. So if they did, I'd turn up there and say that. So
I'm pleased to say we've got a PCW downstairs running games. So, hopefully, demonstrating that he did a lot more than running word processors and spreadsheets. But, no, I mean, do tell us, why are you prouder of the PCW over the CPC? Well, apart from, no question, it's a great machine, yes.
well, it's a better machine. It had CPM. You could get lots of CPM software for it. Although, in fact, it got a flying start because we put CPM on the 6128.
Yes.
And people just rolled over their business software from the 6128 to the PCW because it was a better machine to run that sort of business software on. It sold we probably sold more than twice as many PCWs as we did CPCs. They were they were very affordable for what they did because they included a printer.
That's right.
We sold it for about the same price as everyone else was selling just a printer. Okay, so it was really good value for money, but it was still almost twice as expensive as a CPC. So if you sell twice as many of them and it's twice the price, there's 4 times as much money coming in there, so that's good for the company. But it's also good for hundreds of thousands of people who wrote their first novel or their first, wrote their thesis or dissertation, or vicars famously writing their sermons on it. So there's a lot of people who benefited from the PCW, not just playing games on it. It was actually a really important tool and in many cases literally changed their lives.
Oh, no question. I mean, it was an absolute marvel for anyone that needed to write stuff. But moreover, I mean, I think arguably it revolutionised 1980s small business in the UK. It gave small businesses an opportunity to get in and start digitalising their business when other systems were really just out of their reach. If you think about it, what was it? It was about £399, I think it was.
Yeah,
at that point,
that's the entry level one. Yeah.
Yeah, got you the entry level PCW with everything ready to go. Otherwise you were looking at early systems, early IBM systems, CPM stuff from people like Kalamazoo and things like that cost, well, probably easily into 4 figures, just for a computer, let alone before you bought printers or anything else. That's what kept so many small businesses up until that point, still working with paper and pen.
Well, also, one of the things with the PCW was the original spec we were given had a vertical screen. And the idea was that you would have a whole A4 letter or whatever it was you were writing. Because it was really originally made for correspondence. It's mostly a typewriter replacement. And we didn't kind of at that point envisage people writing 200-page novels on it. It was just kind of 1 or 2-page business letters. And the problem was that looking at although it was a great idea, all right, that was Lord Sugar's idea again, that we'll have it like that. If you actually look at the electronics required to put a whole A4 page on a screen, you just can't do it for the money. You'd have much more expensive tube, much more expensive everything else. But what we did do was we made it, I think, 90 characters wide, was it 96, I can't remember, rather than 80, and 32 deep. So there's almost twice as many characters on the screen on a PCW as there is on a high-res 464. And the main trick was, if you're typing a business letter and you get near the end of the line, it doesn't scroll sideways. All right, whereas you do that on a contemporary IBM PC or other machines like that, which still only has 64 character screens.
That's right, they're still shunted left to right.
You get a headache because the thing you're trying to type would be scrolling left and right the whole flipping time. And then people used to complain about the quality of the printer. Well, there was a high-res mode in the printer which did multiple passes, and so emulated, I think it was 27 or some number like that pin printer, and that was perfectly good enough for writing letters to your, printing out invoices and writing letters. And if you've just written a novel, or having it in draft mode is better than having to type it on a Steam typewriter or write it out longhand. So, it's still perfectly readable.
Yeah, definitely. And I remember that the Amstrad ran a very interesting promo at one point where you get a discount on a PCW by trading in your typewriter, which was quite a successful deal because all those typewriters that got traded in then got given to some government retraining scheme where they were given to people that were relearning office skills. I know this because my mum ended up with one. Which, again, perpetuated getting more people back into work. And funny enough, when she then got her first job after that retraining, the company she worked for, went out and bought 3 PCWs, funnily enough.
Okay. Yeah.
Any more questions from the floor? Yes, sir.
You sort of alluded to earlier that Amstrad at the time was producing sort of hit products each year, so I guess it was imagined the CPC would have quite a short life of a hit product for 1 year, you have follow-up products. Did it surprise you that it sort of continued on for years and they kept on selling into the early 90s? And also, through to today, did you imagine that 40 years later people would be writing new software for the CPC, still using them at home, showing their kids and grandkids, sort of what they are?
Well, I think it was obvious by the time it was launched, which was in Easter in that year, it was obvious by then that this had more mileage in it than just being a one-year blockbuster product, because we were already beginning to look at the PCW as a follow-on for it quite soon afterwards. And so we'd kind of changed the direction of the company and the sort of products they made. Also, the retailers were very pleased with the products, because if you sold 100 of these, it'd be really bad luck if more than one of them came back. Okay, if you sold 100 Sinclair Spectrums, about 30 of them would come back. All right, and that just kills you if you're a retailer. So they liked them. The PCW Dixon's liked it so much that they said, right, we'll sell this for you. I remember going with the boss to see Stanley Calmes as the chairman of Dixon's group, and we went round there with the PCW and we plunked it on the table. And one of my kind of jobs was to demonstrate things like that to people, or go to trade shows and demonstrate computers. So we demonstrated to him and said, okay, all right, I'll buy X amount of those, but I need a 3-month exclusive. Okay, and so he said, oh, okay then, because we knew how many we could manufacture, because you have to ramp the production up. You can't just start off making 50,000 a month. It doesn't work. Manufacturing doesn't work like that. And we said, well, if you can buy all we can make for 3 months, and then after that, when we're making bigger quantities, then we'll sell some through Rumbelows or whatever. That's fine by us. And we actually changed Dixon's business model, because their rule was that if somebody wandered in off the high street on a infamous wet Saturday afternoon, which I think we've got one here, haven't we?
Yep.
And said, I'd like to buy a music centre or a car radio or a hi-fi or something like that, and I've seen this one in the advert, what about that? If it was out of stock, the salesman wasn't allowed to let you leave the shop unless he'd sold you something slightly similar, but not the one you walked in to buy. Okay? You'd still be perfectly happy with what you bought, but you couldn't just walk in and say, I want, it's not like going to Screwfix and saying, I want one of these, and they say, here you go. And so the thing that Dixon's did, which changed their business model, was there was such a high demand. Firstly, there was nothing to switch sell it to, because there was absolutely nothing else like it. And secondly, they started taking a waiting list. So you went into your Dixons and said, I'd like to buy a PCW, here's my £400. And they go, oh, sorry, we're about out of stock. We're getting a couple of dozen in next Thursday. And they had a little list under the counter. And then they ring up a couple of these people, and then word would leak out and say, oh, they've arrived. So people would rush around there on the Thursday morning, buy them. And that was something that Dixons certainly had never done before. And that following year, the PCW was Dixon's single most profitable product that they sold in their shops. Previously, the single most profitable thing they'd sold in the shops was those Amstrad tower systems. But we kind of overtook that with the computers. And we were just, I remember we went to a, curiously, PCW show, big coincidence, the name, although both of us got on very well, because I used to write articles for PCW and things in my spare time as well. The first PCW show, we took the PCW word processor, and if we'd had a dozen containers full of them in the car park, this is Olympia, if we had a dozen containers full of them in the car park, we'd have sold the lot. But there you go.
Any more questions? Yes, sir.
Just a quick one. I grew up in Australia and I knew one kid at school with a CPC. He wasn't very popular.
No, he was the coolest kid in your class, admit it. Come on.
Everyone had Commodore 64s and Big 20s and the like. Commodore. How were international sales of the CPC? Were there any sort of foreign markets that you didn't expect?
Well, we didn't sell very many to Australia, although there was a model for Australia. And I'm in contact with I did a Zoom interview with an Australian magazine last week or the week before last, so I don't know where that's going to appear. So they do have a small user group there. Obviously, so we've talked about Spain. France was quite big, Germany was quite big, but then I don't think we sold it to very many other places. We tried to sell it through the States, but they said, well, we can't. So went to people like the equivalent of, there's a big chain of stores out there which is a bit like John Lewis, so we tried selling it to them, and they said, well, we can't put this on the shelves because it's only got 64K of memory, and that's last year's memory size. So we had to rush the 6128 through in order to get it on the shelves in the States, and then it trickled back to Europe. But they weren't sold in a great deal of other countries. The PCW, on the other hand, we ended up doing something like 25 or 30 different foreign language translations. I kind of assumed that therefore it ended up being sold in that many different countries. although actually some of it's, I don't know how much you're all into politics, but we did a Catalonian translation of the word processing software for the Catalonians in Spain, which probably rubbed the people in Madrid up the wrong way, but there you go.
Were there Soviet knockoffs?
A few years later, people were starting to clone the 464. I see rumours that they've nearly cloned the gate array, but it's not quite there yet. There's only 625 gates in there, so it's 25 by 25 in a matrix and then wired up. But it's lasted 40 years without somebody being able to make a clone of that. So although there's rumours that the Russians had something that was close to a clone of it, which people are now... Because the latest big thing is people trying to make a brand new 464. So what they're literally doing is they're making new circuit boards, they're 3D printing the cases, they're doing all sorts of crazy stuff, and there's that one chip there that they still can't get. But you talked to me, I didn't fully answer the earlier question, am I surprised that it's become sort of suddenly a retro craze? Well, one of the reasons why I'm here today is because I was moaning on Facebook about 6 months ago saying there doesn't seem to be much of a retro craze about the 464 in the UK. I still think that's true. I think there's a much bigger Spectrum and BBC Micro retro craze.
Sadly, yes.
But in Spain and now in France, someone's got some EU funding for a computer museum in France somewhere, and they'll probably have some CPCs in that. There's another museum in Alicante, computer museum, which I'm going to see in the summer, and they're going to have a little Amstrad corner there. But retro things, it doesn't matter if it's an E-Type Jaguar or vinyl records, something, or dinky toys or Scalextrics. When people get to a certain age, they think, well, I wonder if can I relive my youth by buying one of these older things and showing it to my children, saying, oh, this is what your dad used to use 30, 40 years ago. And it's just inevitable that home computers would come into that ebb and flow of the retro market. It just hasn't, I still insist that it hasn't happened as much in the UK yet as it has in some other countries. Whether it will ebb again before it flows properly in the UK, who knows? I'm doing my best this year at the 40th anniversary, right? I tried really hard at the 30th, no one was interested. I tried really hard at the 35th, no one was interested. I tried really hard at the 39th, all right, because to us in the team, and we've got all the team there, it's not just me, there's a whole heap of other people, about 30 of us working on it 6 months into the project, and I was just in charge of marshalling them all and making sure they were keeping on spec and to budget and talking to one another. I think lost my thread again. That's right, the 39th.
Yeah.
So to us, the anniversary is that date in August when we got visited, and then about a week and a half later we drew up the spec.
Yeah.
That's in the heart of the team, that's our anniversary. In fact, on the bottom one of that row of pictures there, which I found online really only a couple of days ago, is Bob Watkins, who was the Amstrad guy who came to see us. And in the background, there's the Ambit building. We're working at Ambit, which is where he came to visit us with this thing and said, can you help us out? The third picture's a little bit out of the timeline, because that's by when we'd all moved into Brentwood House, and that was my lab with all my staff in probably about the middle of the following summer.
Okay. So, I mean, given... Oh, so I'll come to you in one sec. But given what you just said about, obviously trying to ignite a bit more retro passion around the CPC, chances of getting someone to do a retro, mini reboot like we've seen with so many of the other platforms, do you think we'll ever see one?
I think everything, it can either happen organically, okay,
Yeah.
so I don't think there's somebody from one of the big record companies creating the boom in vinyl, okay, and retro players, all right. I don't think there's anybody from any of the car companies going around and saying, oh, you really ought to go and buy a, 45-year-old E-type Jaguar or a 50-year-old tractor. I gather collecting old tractors is very much of a thing.
Yeah.
With computers, I don't know. I don't know whether it can grow organically like that or whether it needs a sponsor. In Spain, they're very lucky because they've got AUA, which is the Spanish club of Amstrad users, and they're very enthusiastic.
Yes.
And they have events. They go not quite every weekend, but somewhere in Spain there's a retro event, a bit like this, and they stick all the stuff in the back of their van and go off to it. And they're very, very, very good catalyst. They're coming to see me next week, actually. So you probably need somebody driving it, okay? And I can't immediately see anybody who would drive that in the UK. I mean, events such as this are doing a great job. What they're doing, went to just as good an event in Wolverhampton last weekend, which was about 50% consoles, 50% arcade machines.
That was Revival, I think.
That's Revival, yeah. So there's dedicated people doing these one-off conferences or whatever you want to call them. I don't see anybody coordinating something on a grander scale than that.
You don't suppose we could convince Alan to bankroll something?
I honestly don't think he's interested. He made a throwaway comment about 4 years ago, which got everybody excited. He said, "Oh, I think I'm going to start an Amstrad museum." I don't know where that idea came from, and and then I got hold of them and said, "Well, actually, if you're going to do an Amstrad museum, I'd be quite interested in helping out you with some of the computer things." And the answer came back, "Oh no, he's just thinking out loud. He's not going to do that. He's much more interested in." The Apprentice and
But it's worth
this
noting.
and that, and living in Florida and
Have you
driving as
noticed,
fast cars
though,
and things.
Roland, how often this machine turns up on The Apprentice? It's probably shown up more than any other Amstrad product that's existed.
Right.
There's been challenges where they've had to go and find and buy one of these.
Oh.
Even in the last season of The Apprentice, there was one episode where they were doing, I think it was like virtual escape rooms or something. And they created this like example environment was to explain to the contestants. And pretty much the first thing you saw when they walked into this virtual room was one of these on the table.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
He's probably got a few that he lends out to the production company. One of the things back in the day that we used to do was we used to play Spot the Amstrad on TV, and there was one in EastEnders.
EastEnders, that's right.
So, and there's two ways to get your product onto EastEnders. You either spend enormous amounts of money on a PR company who nag the production company to put one of your computers on their show rather than the Commodore 64 or something else, or you actually just sit there and do absolutely nothing. And one day, someone on the production team says, "Oh, we need a computer. Go down to Dixon's and buy buy one that looks pretty." And they always came back with an Amstrad.
Yes.
And I think there was the day it was the first one on Coronation Street. There was one on Doctor Who.
There's one, yeah. This is apparently is the remote control unit for the
Yeah.
TARDIS. It
Yeah.
turns out
Was there one on Fools and Horses as well?
there was.
Yeah, could easily have been.
Yeah. Rodney had one.
We've seen none of those appearances on TV back then were anything to do with us. All right, we did have some very talented PR people and promotions people, but it wasn't part of their job to get the thing onto TV. Whereas there's other companies, it's called product placement.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if any of you are film fans, but if you watch Home Alone and films like that from that vintage, if you see an airport and a plane taking off or landing, it is always an American Airlines plane. It's never a Delta plane or a Pan Am plane or a British Airways plane. It's always an American Airlines plane.
That's right.
Because American Airlines has got a team of people that actually my wife used to work with, whose job it is to get American Airlines planes into feature films. and they'll just lend you one for the day. So you don't have to kind of get some stock footage.
Yeah.
You say, oh, we'd like to film one of your planes landing. They say, all right, where, when? Off you go then.
Yeah, we'll bring you one.
Yeah. And also product placement is in Midsummer Murders. They're always driving Volvos. I don't know if you noticed that.
Yes.
Right, for the last 25 years, they've always been driving brand new Volvos. Policemen can't afford a brand new Volvo on their salary, but never mind, there they are.
Now Apple did something similar.
Mm-hmm.
Apple computers, you always say Apple.
Yeah, a lot of companies put a lot of time and money and effort into doing that, and good luck to them. Just saying that if you see one of these on EastEnders, it's not because we put a lot of effort into it. We could have done, but
So you're talking about the Star Trek where Scotty says hello computer?
Well, Apple, you see, whenever an Apple, yeah, one of those.
Yeah.
Latest
Because
Yeah.
that was supposed to be an Amiga. They asked
Oh,
for
right.
Amigas and I said no, you go buy one. So Apple went in. So
Yeah.
product
Yeah.
placement.
That's why Apple have the logo now. Microsoft have the logo on there.
there's an awful lot of product placement of Microsoft Surface tablets
That's right.
in the media as well. They're absolutely everywhere, much more than you've ever seen one. I mean, I've got one. I've got one that works and one that's broken. I'm not sure I've ever seen another one in the wild, but on TV, everyone's using the things.
If you ever watched the reboot of Hawaii 5.0, Microsoft used to throw a lot of product placement money at that, to the point that in one episode they actually uttered the immortal line, "Let me Bing that for you." Ugh. Right, one last question, the gentleman in the back.
Yeah, in terms of product placement, I know there's also a photo of the actor Christian Bale with his 464.
Yeah.
Obviously there was Jimmy, not commercial. I'm just wondering if you have some definitive sales figures for the CPC, because there are lots of rumors out there. Wikipedia says 3 million units, I think.
Well, nobody used to tell us, you see, because we were a team, all right? My bit of the team, some in-house, some contractors. We'd get it all together, and then we'd hand this over to Bob Watkins and his people and say, there you go, it works, now go off and make 50,000 of them. And he had a very talented team of people who went and did that, and then he went to see the sales and marketing people and said, right, these are coming off the production line, do some publicity material, go and visit the retail shops, and you do that bit. So it's this kind of pass the parcel thing all the time. Therefore, we're somewhat at arm's length from the salespeople, and so they didn't bother to tell us, and we weren't sufficiently curious as to how many of them they're actually shipping at the end of the day. So we hear these rumours, and this sort of 3 or 4 million for the CPC is what stuck, about 8 million maybe for the PCW. But I don't have any kind of insider information in that, I'm afraid.
Do you think there's anybody out there who will still have this info somewhere?
Well, Bob Watkins would know, but you have to find him first.
Well, I can actually help with that. Back when I was technical editor of Computing magazine, for our 30th anniversary, we were originally arranging for Alan Sugar to speak at our annual awards, and we were putting together some stuff that was going to be like sort of the preamble to that. And we did speak to Bob, and the figure he gave us was 4 million. Which I think sounds plausible.
Yes, it sounds entirely plausible. Because I think we made the CP, the 464 was more enduring than the 6128.
Yes.
Because 6128 people tended to migrate across to the PCW for
That's
a lot
right.
of the functionality in it. And not very many people wrote 128K games anyway. So I think it was sold until, it started off in, 84, and probably sold until about 92, something like that.
It's about that, yeah.
So it had a much longer product life.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to talk about what's happening on Friday.
Oh, this is just... I'm hosting an event which is originally for people on the team and people we worked with in the retail trade and things like that. I'm just having a pop-up lunch. It's at the Green Man in Paddington, which is next door to the Rumbelows, where the first computer of these computers went on sale on the 21st of June 40 years ago. So I'm going to be there. It's right next door to Edgware Road, Bakerloo Station.
Yeah.
I'm just going to be there lurking like I'm lurking here today from 11 till 2, and I'll hang on if there's people around. People can come along and I'll talk to them and sign things, or save yourself the bother and come and talk to me this afternoon here.
Well, with that, Roland Perry, thank you so much
It's
for your time.
been a
Thank you
pleasure
for
to be
a
here.
wonderful set of insights into the development of the CPC. Roland,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.